We have another update about the continuing fallout of the T app. That's right, the app designed for women to share information about men that they might be dating. We did a whole episode about this where we talked about how men were saying we should have our own T app where men can talk about the women. Do you think that men need a dedicated app to do this? Men have been like sharing like pictures of women and talking about women on group chats since forever. You don't need a dedicated platform to do it, but whatever. So the TeaOnHer app was meant to be exactly that. And TechCrunch reports that the TeaOnHer app, the app for men to talk about women, has also exposed users' personal information, including government IDs and selfies. A step in the right direction when it comes to gender equality and progress, no?
Just classic race to the bottom stuff. Like, no one can have anything nice.
I envision a world where all genders can have our data privacy compromised by sketchy apps in the name of gender equality. The TeaOnHer app, which launched on the Apple App Store earlier this week and shot to number 2 in the lifestyle category on the App Store, it borrowed language from the original T app for women in its description. Here is what TechCrunch found. TechCrunch found at least one security flaw that allows anyone to access data belonging to TeaOnHer app users, including their usernames and associated email addresses, as well as driver's licenses and selfies that users uploaded to the app. Images of these driver's licenses are publicly accessible web addresses, allowing anybody with the links to access them using their web browser. In one case, TechCrunch saw a list of posts shared on the TeaOnHer app appended with each user's email address, display name, and self-reported location. It gets worse because TechCrunch also identified a potential second security issue in which an email address and plain text password belonging to the app's creator was left exposed on the server. The credentials appeared to grant access to the app's admin panel. TechCrunch did not use the credentials because doing so would be illegal, but it does highlight the risks of inadvertently leaving admin credentials exposed to the web. What are we doing?
Oh, really? That's risky?
It's risky. You
You're not
shouldn't do
supposed to
it.
expose your admin credentials to the entire internet?
I mean, I wouldn't.
No, I generally keep my admin credentials to myself.
What's interesting to me is that the conversation when the T app breach first happened, where all of these women who had uploaded their driver's licenses and their selfies to this app had their personal information leaked online, a lot of people were saying, well, the women wanted to gossip about men and, turnabout is fair play, that their stuff would be leaked online. I feel like I have, one, heard a lot less about the TeaOnHer app being susceptible to these kind of breaches. And two, I don't feel like there's the same kind of like moral hand wringing about, well, do these men, like, is this turnabout is fair play for these men who wanted tea on women? Now they're having their information exposed. It's very interesting to me how different the conversations were around these two different apps and their user bases. I read this really interesting piece in Encyclopedia Britannica by Britt Biscoff called "The Manosphere is the Motherboard, the T-App Hack Media Landscape." And one of the points that I found very interesting and kind of clarifying in that piece was how easily the initial T-App breach was hijacked and how it instantly became this flashpoint of manosphere talking points. And I do think the T app was a situation that was ripe for discussion about, gender and dating and sexuality and privacy and how all of these things intersect with this one story. But we didn't really have that conversation because it was so easily weaponized by manosphere communities. How easily that conversation, which was genuinely fertile soil for like genuinely interesting conversations about how we interact with each other, how quickly it just became about gender wars nonsense.
It feels like there's really like two groups that are keeping this thing going. Shitheads that are intentionally trying to like weaponize gender wars as a way to either farm engagement or suppress women. They're like largely the minority, but then there's also this group of men who are like caught up in the nonsense of that first group and are just like afraid of women, and like the only thing they know is gender wars. And so like every single event that is in the news or is being talked about online gets like filtered and transformed to reinforce like a gender war framework.
I do think that gender is one of those issues where the worst people, the most extreme people, the people with an axe to grind, the people who are grifting and trying to make money off of the discontent of others, they have really been able to take an outsized footprint in the conversation about gender dynamics. In my experience, when I'm like out in the world, as hard as it is being a woman in the world, a black woman especially, I genuinely think that the in real life way that we interact with each other, which is not perfect by any means, I don't think it is so deeply colored the way that online conversations would have you believe sometimes. I genuinely believe that we have let a small subsection of very loud, very vocal extremists who are in the minority dictate what the conversation is and like really paint an impression that perhaps it's not always the impression that is happening. And then when you have big flashpoints like the T app, that faction explodes, right? And they get to be like, we told you so. They get to really so easily dominate the conversation. And I feel very bad for people who are just looking for information about others, right? Like you're just interested in a woman's perspective, or you're just interested, like if you're a guy and you're like, oh, I'm want to know how to approach women or talk to women. The internet is the worst place to go for good faith information in that vein because it is the worst people who are owning the conversation and owning the landscape. It is a real problem.
Absolutely. You know, when I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, I had the great fortune to study with this amazing professor, Dr. Janet Hyde. A big part of her career was uh, advocating for what she called the gender similarities hypothesis. The idea that men and women have so much more in common than they have that than are different between them, and yet for various reasons, partly because of that cadre of extremists you mentioned, but also other reasons throughout society. We just love to focus on the differences, and so we do. We talk about the differences and we focus on the differences and reinforce the differences to the exclusion of the fact that like actually come on, like it's not really that different. Like men and women for the most part, like we just want to watch a comedy and like eat a burger or like a salad if you're a vegetarian. The differences are not that great, and yet there's this big investment in like focusing on the differences that gives them this outsized weight.
Yeah, I agree. So you actually did a little bit of research into the T on Her app, right? More than I did.
I did just a little bit. I was just like curious about it because something about it felt strange to me.
Hinky. That's a, when I
Hinky.
was reporting on the T app, the thing that I said was that it felt hinky and that it just didn't something didn't sound right. And this it sounds like you found the T on Her app similarly hinky.
The story arc was too quick that it went from like not existing to being released to suffering the same types of security breaches as the T app within like a week, putting sensitive information in public buckets with public URLs that were not secured, which is insane. It's hard to imagine that somebody would do that in the first place, and it's even harder to imagine that somebody would commit that same error of an app that they had replicated that had suffered that exact breach like a week before. But you might think that like if you were creating a copycat app that was adapted for men instead of women, maybe a little light bulb would go off and be like, "Hey, what if we make these private URLs?" And also, like, requiring the users to upload their driver's licenses, that's another big red flag for me because as you talked about, age verification is actually a dangerous morass. It sounds like the T app realized this like 2 years ago and stopped requiring users to do that.
That's right.
I have to assume that part of their rationale was that this is a dangerous thing to do, to just be even, like, handling that level of sensitive information, and yet the T on Her app did it. And I have to wonder, perhaps this was all just a fishing expedition to get a bunch of sensitive information about a bunch of men. It seemed to be created by this guy, Xavier Lampkin, from the Newville Media Corporation. Couldn't find a whole lot about either of them online. But it just seemed really, I guess, hinky is a good word.
I mean, that was exactly my experience when I was first doing research on the T app. I looked into the founder and I was like, okay, he has a paper trail, like a history, an employment history that checks out. But it seemed so absurd that I was like, is this some sort of a scheme?
And I remember we talked about that, and I actually talked you down from that. I was like, "No, no, I don't think it's a scheme. You're really underestimating the incompetence and laziness of humans who work in software development and data, where we're just trying to do things really fast." And I could see how somebody would back up that database to a public bucket and plan to go back and lock it down later. They never did. So I talked you down. I think incompetence can fully explain what happened with the T app. But then for somebody else to replicate it a week later and the same errors, I don't know.
And after there was so much reporting about the driver's license and selfie aspect of it, that, oh, these women, when this app was breached, their driver's licenses with their addresses on them were floating around the internet. I don't know how you could have been even nominally paying attention to that story and then a handful of days later be like, new app wants my driver's license that has T in the name of the app. I'm going to do it. I'm with you. As you know, I went on an evolution of thinking this is some sort of a scheme to this is just incompetence. And I do suspect, like, if I don't know, but this is my opinion, my take. I think that these apps are just being quickly pushed out to capitalize on exactly the kind of gender wars stuff we were just talking about. And so I think when you are rushing, when you want to be part of a current conversation and you want to get there quickly, it doesn't really surprise me then that maybe things like security for your user base would take a back seat when the only thing that you're worried about is capitalizing on this big engagement splashy moment about gender wars. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. I totally do. I think that same asymmetrical criticism that you described of how, like, when the T app came out, so many men were writing about how it was like messed up and like how dare these women like besmirch men and it's unfair. With this new Tea on Her app, there's just like none of that. It's just like a
No.
vacuum of conversation. And I think that that lack of scrutiny and that lack of conversation about it, I think perhaps is giving companies a pass to just exploit and steal data from their male users without commentary. Like I couldn't find anything about it when I was searching earlier today.
Neither could I. The men who sign up for this app are the product, right? I saw through this as marketing bullshit, but at least for the T app for women, the creator who was a man was like, oh, well, my mother dated and I wanted to make an app where women wouldn't have to face dangerous experiences when they dated, yada, yada, yada. Whether you believe that or not, I happen to not really believe that. I think it's just marketing. At least there was some nod to the fact that this is an app created for women to keep women safe. Sure, fine, whatever. I think that for the TeaOnHer app for men to talk about women, I think it is like this is someone who is interested in capitalizing on the current conversation around gender wars, and the men who sign up for the app, even if they're promised like, oh, you can find out all the tea on these women, da 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 da. They are the product who is being exploited, as evidenced by the fact that they didn't even do the bare minimum to keep their data safe. So yeah, it's just the worst people dominating the conversation, and people who of all genders who might actually be trying to use these apps to keep themselves safe are being exploited by people who do not actually care about that are selling them a false bill of sale. I guess that's my ultimate point.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody deserves better. Women deserve better. Men deserve better. We all deserve better.
Exactly.